that were given maybe 2,500 years ago in a very different world to people who had a very different worldview. And sometimes they need a bit of translating. Sometimes they need a bit of translating for modern world. They need a bit of explicating to a modern worldview. Sometimes they've been widely distorted or misinterpreted, and we want to clarify them. So we're, as it were, bringing these ancient teachings home to Sheffield in the 21st century, seeing how we can use them in our lives, in our practices. And often we're looking at how our founder, Sangharajta, the founder of our order, Sangharajta, has sort of translated these traditional teachings for our time. And sometimes also we're adding our own ideas as well. So the title of my talk tonight is What Meditation Really Is. And I'll be loosely basing this on a talk given by Sangharajta way back in the very early days of Triratna. It might even be before Triratna existed, I don't actually know, but it's from the tone of it, it's very early and delivered to non-Buddhists, basically, delivered to people who don't practice. So I might expand on it a little bit. And in the talk, he says that here in the West, there's a lot of misunderstanding about what the purpose and the nature of meditation are. And quite a long while later, I think there still might be, actually. And he relates this misunderstanding about the purpose and the nature of misunderstanding to another traditional Buddhist idea, which is probably also needs quite a lot of translation for our time. Because it really doesn't fit very well into the modern Western worldview. And that is that we exist, beings exist, on, as it were, different planes of being, different dimensions of being, some higher than others, so that they create what you could call, what has been called, a ladder of being. And these different levels of being, planes of being, are often actually seen as different places, actual places, worlds we can inhabit. In the early Buddhist world, they were called lokas, various loka, or lokas, which is related, the same root as our word location, and local and such. It means a place. So different levels of being were also places. They were worlds. And these different worlds existed side by side, in one sense, but in another sense, as it were, stacked on top of each other to create this ladder of being. And these lokas were both places and levels of consciousness, levels of being. So in traditional Buddhism, it seems to have been completely accepted that the world we live in and our mental state or our level of consciousness are two sides of the same coin. That seems to have just been completely accepted. So, for example, we've got the 6 realms of the Wheel of Life. Many of you will be familiar with the 6 realms of the Wheel of Life. And in traditional Buddhism, these are seen as actual places into which we are reborn. According to the sort of being we have become in this life, we are reborn into the appropriate realm, which is a sort of reflection of our state. So if we're a hellish being, we're reborn in a hellish world. Which is an outer manifestation of our inner state. It's not any sort of punishment, it's just an outer manifestation of our inner state. If we're an addictive being, we're reborn in the realm of the hungry ghosts, a world of constant unsatisfied craving. If we exist on an animal level, just focused on food, sex, comfort, safety, we're reborn in the animal realm. If we're a massive combative ego, always fighting for something, then we're reborn in the world of the constantly fighting Asuras, the Titans. If we're a godlike being, we're reborn in a heaven-like world of refined beauty. And if we're a truly human being, we're reborn in the human realm. And these realms were seen as states of being. And traditionally, they're also actual places in which we can be reborn, in which we will be reborn. That's the traditional teaching. But Sangharakshita, the founder of our order, has pointed out that we don't need to die and be reborn to spend time in these realms. These different realms on the wheel of life. We all experience at least some of these realms. We've experienced all these realms, but we experience them now. And we could go out into the streets of Sheffield and find people who mainly exist in every single one of these realms as their state of being. Some might be living in very dark places of ugliness. Some might be living in a bright, cheerful world. Some might live in a threatening world of constant strife, constant struggle, constant danger. And they would all see and experience the world very differently from each other. The same physical space. They might inhabit the same physical space, but they really would, in a sense, be in different worlds. So that idea, that's just an example of the way traditional Buddhism sees the realm we inhabit and our state of being as being two sides of the same coin. One is the reflection of the other. So these 6 realms of the wheel of life, they're a bit of a going off at a tangent because they're not the same as the lokas of early Buddhism that I was talking about, but they illustrate the same worldview. They illustrate this worldview which runs right through traditional Buddhism, that the realm in which we live in is a sort of reflection of the sort of being we are, the sort of level of consciousness that we have. There are different planes of being stacked one above the other, which amount to different worlds, some higher than the others, according to the level of consciousness of the beings who exist there. The higher the realm, the more clearly beings see reality, the wider the perspective they've got, the more empathy they've got for others, the more they're free from inner drives that control them. The more the world they live in is a place of metta and compassion and joy. And connecting a bit to Pradaya's talk last week, the more the realm they live in is a place of beauty as well. Okay, so what is the connection? I said that Sangharakshita introduced those 2 ideas. Well, the idea that meditation is widely misinterpreted, and this idea of different levels of being. Many levels of being representing different levels of consciousness. What's the connection? Well, recently I reread Philip Pullman's Dark Materials trilogy. I don't know if you've read it. Some people really like it. And these books are built around, they're built around the idea that there are many different universes existing side by side, but completely separate from each other. The beings in one universe have no idea about the endless other universes that exist right side by side. And apparently this is based on the many universes theory, which is apparently a perfectly respectable theory in modern physics based on the quantum mechanics idea. It's not even bonkers. So many universes sitting side by side, and in his first book, the heroine, Laura Belacqua, later Laura Silvertongue, I believe, finds her way into a parallel universe, which has been blasted open for a rift in reality that's been created by her somewhat Asura-like father, Lord Asriel. So she finds her way into a different world. And then in the second book, she meets a boy called Will, who actually comes from our world and has also found his way into this other world. She meets this boy called Will, who is the finder and the bearer of the subtle knife, which is the name of the second book. And the subtle knife has this quality that in the right hands, with the right knowledge, it can cut a doorway from one universe into another. But it doesn't cut, so it can cut a doorway from one universe. It can open a portal so that Will and Laura can travel between worlds, which is what happens in these books. They can walk from one universe into another. The traditional view of meditation at its highest is that meditation is like the subtle knife. In the right hands, used in the right way, it can create a doorway into another world. It can open a portal into another world. But not just any old world, not just any old world, it opens a doorway into a higher plane of being. With the right preparation, we can create that doorway for ourselves. We can walk into another higher plane of being. We can breathe the atmosphere of another world, a higher world, and bring back some of that beauty, some of the beauty of that world, and the radiance of that world into our normal lives. Speaking poetically, we can even meet the beings of this higher world, and beings of a higher level of consciousness, and we can be advised and guided by them. That is the traditional view of what meditation is all about at its highest. So I've already given the plot of my talk away by talking about meditation as a portal to a higher realm of being. And it might seem, what I've been talking about might seem so far from our normal experience that you're so far-fetched even that you're just thinking, well, what's it got to do with me? So I'd like to backtrack. A bit. I'm going to come back to the portals idea, the doorways into a different level of being, but I'd like to backtrack and explore some of the other talks, some of the other aspects of this early talk of Sangharakshita's on what meditation really is, which can also make it plain that meditation can have lots and lots of benefits, perhaps short of walking into another world. So in this early talk of Sangharakshita's, he says that in the West there are a lot of misunderstandings and misconceptions about what meditation really is. But he says this isn't surprising. It isn't surprising because meditation is not really a familiar concept in our culture. It was there a bit more hundreds of years ago, but it's really gone out of our culture. It's only been reintroduced in a matter of decades now, I suppose. Whereas in the traditional Buddhist world, there is this really rich vocabulary for types of meditation and meditative states, different states we can get into in meditation. And so there's all these different words even used for meditation and different meditative states, and we lump all that together under the single term meditation. And then we look at it from a perspective that is a completely different worldview from the world of the Buddha and the people at the Buddha's time. So it's not all that surprising, it's not at all surprising that we have misconceptions about what it was all about, what it's for, what it is and what it's for. So Sangharakshita starts, basically, having said that, he starts his talk by telling us a few things that meditation is not. And I'm going to add some of my own. So one of the things he points out straight off is that, okay, we've talked about levels of consciousness, that Buddhism is all about helping us to move from a lower to a higher level of consciousness. If you like, speaking mythically, poetically, moving from one of these planes of beings to a higher one. That's what Buddhism is all about, and that's what meditation is all about. But one thing meditation is not is the only way to do this. It's not the only way to do this. The whole of Buddhism is about that. But meditation, if you like, is the inner subjective tool that we use to do that. But it's absolutely not the only way, and the Buddha makes it very clear it's not much use on its own. So Sangharashtra talks about other ways, more sort of outer ways of raising our level of being. He talks about the practice of ethics, living an ethical, upright life. The Buddha made it very plain that meditation needs to go along with that, or it's not going to be effective. Sangharashtra also talks about putting ourselves in the right circumstances, putting ourselves in circumstances that bring out what is highest in us. That he says this can have a huge influence on our level of being. He talks about workplaces, he talks about all sorts of other things, but this can have a huge influence on our level of being. It can raise us up to a different level of being. And in particular, he talks about spending time with the Sangha and spending time with spiritual friends. And especially people more experienced than ourselves. So there's suttas in the Pali Canon where the Buddha makes the point that it's likely to be much more important to us, especially when we're sort of relatively early on in the path. The phrase he uses is when heart's release is immature. What's going to be really important, more important than meditation, is spiritual friendship, and especially spiritual friendship with people who are more experienced than we are. When we spend time with, people who maybe, you might even admit it, they might even inhabit a slightly higher plane of being than we do. And when we spend time with such people who inhabit a slightly higher plane of being than we do, it's as though we are pulled up. It's as though we are pulled up to that plane, a higher plane that we usually live on. We tend to be pulled up to this higher level of being ourselves. So that's one way, and that's a way that the Buddha really, really emphasized. Spending time with spiritual friends, especially spending time with people who are maybe a bit further along the path than we are. One he doesn't talk about, but I'm going to, is studying the Dharma, actually. He probably didn't have, there probably wasn't much impetus to study the Dharma from the people he was talking to because they weren't even Buddhists. But studying the Dharma. In our Mitra study group, we're looking at a text called the Bodhicharyavatara. And I think we'd probably all agree it's written by somebody who inhabited a higher level of being than we do. And so when we enter that text, when we sort of put ourselves into that text, we enter his world. It's as though we come to spend a little bit of time inhabiting that higher level of being, and we are raised up by it. Studying the Dharma in that way can have that really strong effect in exactly the same way that meditation can. He also talks about the arts as a way of exposing ourselves to beauty. Connecting again back to Vadanya's talk last week, exposing ourselves to beauty. Higher states are characterized by beauty, and the experience of beauty moves us up to higher states. Great works of art come from, it's as though whoever was communicating, whoever was doing them, was at the time they made them inhabiting a higher realm than we are. And that's why they are so beautiful, and just exposing ourselves to them raises us up to a higher level, raises it up to somewhere near that level. So all those ways are other ways, direct ways, outer ways of raising our level of being. And I think this is really important to cotton. Meditation is about that, but so are lots of other Buddhist practices, because there is a sort of near enemy of the Dharma, which has become quite common in the West, which is that meditation is all about, that Buddhism is all about meditation. I was going to say that meditation is all about Buddhism. That Buddhism is all about meditation. That we're studying the Dharma, that's just a bit of a, it's just words, you don't have to do that. That you don't need Sangha, spiritual friendship, even ethics can be dispensed with. It's all about, what you do in the privacy of your own meditation room at home. So I think it's really important to cotton on that the Buddha is very clear that meditation on its own, certainly while heart's release is immature, as he puts it, it's not the be-all and end-all by any means. The other aspects are more important in a way. Although meditation is, of course, a really important aspect. So having said that, Sangha moves on to some common misconceptions, I think, which are still around now. So for a start, he says that meditation is not making the mind blank, which many people seem to think it is, a sort of state of no mental activity. You can see how this idea arises, that it's making the mind blank, because many sorts of meditation can involve ways of just helping our usual chaotic mental chatter to settle down, die down. But the aim of that is not to make the mind blank. It involves making the mind clearer, more unified, more vibrant, more effective at seeing the truth, not some sort of blank state. There's probably drugs that will get us into a nice blank state, or hitting ourselves on the head, perhaps, something like that. He also says that meditation is not, as he puts it, I'm using his words, not sitting and doing nothing. It's not sitting and doing nothing. He says sitting and doing nothing may be a fine thing, but it is not meditation. And sitting and doing nothing may be quite a fine thing. In fact, it may be a really necessary thing to do. Because I think we need time. We need to spend some time to process our experience. We've got so much experience going on. We need some time to process our experience and reflect on our experience. This is a necessity, and if we don't allow time for that to happen, what will happen when we sit down to meditate is our mind will do that anyway. It needs to do it, so that's what it will do. It'll go back over our experience, it'll process our experience, reflect on our experience, when we want to be actually meditating. So, meditation is not just sitting and doing nothing and letting the mind freewheel. Because it involves conscious effort, at least at first it involves conscious effort. We may reach a point in meditation where there's no more conscious effort needed. Something else seems to take over. But to reach that point, we have to make a conscious effort and not just sit and do nothing. So meditation is not just sitting and doing nothing. And I think some confusion can arise about this. Because for experienced meditators, especially who've been practicing a good while, and especially on retreat, getting to the point where no more effort is required can happen very, very quickly. So just sitting down, if you're an experienced meditator, been doing it a long time, and you're maybe in good conditions on retreat, you just sit on your cushion, you take the posture, you maybe smell the incense, and you just connect with all the times you've done it before, and bang, it's very, very easy. It can put us right back where we've been before in a state of meditation, so that seems effortless. And then, such experienced meditators, if they aren't very clever, can go around telling much less experienced meditators, you don't need to make an effort. It's all about just letting it happen. Forgetting all the years of effort they have put in to get to that point. But what happens then is that the less experienced meditator starts by just sitting and then ends up by just drifting and just sinking. So meditation is not just sitting and doing nothing. It requires effort. And Sangha also says it's not sitting quietly and thinking about something. So sitting quietly and thinking about something is a bit more directed and purposeful than just sitting and doing nothing. But it's still not meditation, he says. And it has to be said that some forms of meditation involve sitting and thinking about something. But they involve directing our mind to think about something, but only after the mind has been focused and concentrated and brought together from its usual scattered state, so that our thinking takes on quite a different quality, becomes much more direct and clear and penetrating, so that we can begin to see right to the truth of things, and so that those truths can really go, our whole being is brought together, so it affects our whole being, not just our not just our brain, not just our, as it were, conceptual thinking. It goes to our heart and the guts as well. So he says also that it's not about going into a dreamy, hypnotic state. Shame, never mind. So it's not just about calming down and going all dreamy. It's about cultivating an alert, clear, bright mind as well. It's both calmer and more alert at once. There's a modern Tibetan teacher, actually dead now, but he uses the word precise. It's a precise state of precision, precise mind. I think that gets across something. And finally, Sangharakshita says that meditation is not to be equated with any one particular technique of meditation. And some traditional schools can be guilty of giving this impression, actually. So, for example, it's not uncommon for Soto Zen teachers to say that their particular form of meditation, called Zazen, is proper meditation. This is proper meditation. And all the other sorts of meditation are sort of not quite proper meditation. And as Zen was the first school that was popularised in the West, this idea seems to have rubbed off on quite a few Western practitioners, that that's real meditation. Everything else is not quite right. And finally, I'd like to add one thing that meditation is not to Sangharakshita's list, and that meditation is not just a sort of psychological exercise, and it's not a therapy. And people from a Western mindset, we're often going to see it that way, because that's much more common in our culture. But if we see it that way, we're going to miss something. We're going to miss something profoundly important, which is that meditation at its highest has a transcendental dimension. We could even say it has a magical dimension. It opens us up to influences from beyond our normal mind. I could even say that meditation is not something we do ourselves, ultimately. We do a technique of meditation. We need to do a practice ourselves. We make the effort to follow the breathing or whatever. But this conscious practice that we do is not the ultimate purpose of meditation. We do this conscious practice to open ourselves up to something, to make ourselves receptive to something that seems to come from somewhere beyond our normal personality, our normal mental states. So that's a few things that meditation is not. As Sangharakshita says, there's a rich vocabulary for different sorts of meditation and meditative states in traditional Buddhism. And there are, in fact, quite a few different practices that get lumped, different types of practice that get lumped under the single heading of meditation. One thing I think they probably all have in common is that they involve focusing the mind. Sometimes people say concentrating, they involve concentrating. But to me that sounds too forced. I associate concentration with a rather narrow and forced type of focus of the mind. But we do focus our mind on something. We rest our mind on something. To bring the mind together from its usual scattered state. We need some object of focus. And the most obvious example of this for us in our tradition is the mindfulness of breathing, which we do often. So we rest our attention on the breath. And our energies gradually, our sort of attention gradually becomes unified. We could talk about this as developing mindfulness. Sangharakshita talks about it as developing mindfulness of body, thoughts and emotions. Another word, he also says that another word for mindfulness is we could use for mindfulness is recollectedness. And I think that word recollectedness gets across something quite, it's a very good word, because what we're doing is recollecting all the parts of ourselves which have gone off in different directions, recollecting all the parts of ourselves that are normally quite scattered. We're thinking about this, then we're thinking about that, then we're sort of remembering our holiday, then we're looking forward to what's going to happen next week. Sort of going off in tangential trains of thought, zooming off this way, that way, wanting this at the same time as wanting that you can't have both of, etc., etc., etc. Often scattered attention. You can really get the impression of scattered attention. Go downtown, maybe at Christmas, and look in that shop window, and that person, and attention drawn all over the place. Really scattered. Now that's an extreme example, and you can feel really after an experience like that. But often we are quite scattered, and some of the things about our modern life make that worse. We just go online and we follow this and follow that, follow that, follow that. We're completely out of touch with our body while we're doing it. Our attention gets very scattered. Instead, we rest our mind on an object. In this case, the breath, something quite concrete, something physical, simple physical reality of the breath. And gradually, the elements of our being, the elements of our attention sort of come together and rest together on that. They all get recollected and put on that. And as this happens, we get a sense of all those inner conflicts subsiding a bit. Calm, maybe. Even peace, maybe. Even a bit of clarity, maybe. A greater brightness and alertness and clarity. What's happened has been likened to focusing a torch beam. So it's like our normal mind, our normal scattered self, scattered mind, is like a torch beam that's set in a very dispersed way, so it hardly casts any light when we're going along in the dark. And what we're doing is like focusing our torch beam so that it's bright and penetrating and penetrates the darkness and really shows us things, bringing it together so that it works, so that our mind works, just isn't going off all over the show. More able to illuminate what's in front of it. So Sangharakshita talks about what goes on as we bring ourselves together, recollect ourselves. He talks about what goes on as integration. And he talks about horizontal integration. We recollect parts of ourselves that exist, recollect parts of ourselves that exist on a similar level. Bringing the mind together. But he also says that this focusing of our being also has an effect that he calls vertical integration. Vertical integration. Which is about connecting with what is, in a sense, below and what is, in a sense, above. So it's vertical as well as the horizontal dimension. So connecting with our depths and connecting with our heights. So in meditation, we can become more aware of our depths. These are metaphors. You can put them the other way around if you like. These are metaphors. I'm just using a spatial metaphor. But by depths, I mean what's below our consciousness, our unconscious. The deep forces that usually drive us unconsciously. So that we respond to them without even knowing that we're doing it. So that we can become aware of these forces and bring them into harmony with our conscious volitions, our conscious desires. We can begin to use the tremendous energy that's tied up in these deep drives in skillful ways, rather than being ruled by them from the shadows, as it were, driven by them. So we become aware of our depths as part of vertical integration. We also become more aware of our heights. Heights in our being that we hadn't glimpsed before, probably. Heights in our being that may seem to be actually beyond our normal personality. It may feel a bit as though we've opened a window into a higher dimension of being through which a sort of light is shining through to illumine our normal mind. So I'm going to come back to this idea of unifying our being a bit later, and to this idea of opening up to higher dimensions. I'll do that later, but first I'd like to just touch on a few other practices, other sort of aspects of meditation, practices which go by the name of meditation. So under the heading of meditation, we include what are traditionally called bhavana practices. So you'll be familiar with the metta bhavana. Bhavana means development or becoming. It's also sometimes used as a word that means meditation, simply meditation. So we're familiar with the metta bhavana practice. So you'll know that bhavana practices are about developing a particular quality. In this case, they're about developing metta. They can be about developing other emotions, other emotions. They can be about developing volitions. And the metta bhavana is also about developing a volition. So in the metta bhavana, you could say we use people as our objective focus, I suppose. But as we move on, the more as we do it more and more, metta itself becomes more the object of focus, actually. We bring the people to mind, but it's the metta which is the object of focus. And this metta may even seem to be coming from outside us. It may not seem like I am generating metta, much more like I am becoming aware of the metta, which almost bathes everything, coming from beyond us, wrapping us about. So, yeah, I mean, when people first start meditating, often the metta bhavana can seem, to some people, a difficult practice. It's the mindfulness, the recollecting element of metta bhavana seems to be a bit absent because our mind's jotting around, going to different people, and then we get caught up in trains of thought. But I have to say, as we get more, it's really worth sticking with, because as you get more experienced, the mindfulness of breathing and the metta bhavana tend to come together. They tend to come together so that we experience a mindfulness which is imbued with metta, and a metta which is grounded in mindfulness. So it's really worth sticking with both the practices. They add up to more than the sum of the parts. So another important type of meditation in many traditions involves, well, firstly using a technique like the metta bhavana to focus the mind, and then using that more unified mind to reflect on some truth. So placing the mind on some sort of obvious truth, like the reality of impermanence. We all know about impermanence, but we don't really. And this is about somehow making that part of our being. Or the reality of the law of karma, the fact that unskillfulness, which we often think of as the way to have a good time, is in fact the way that's going to guarantee suffering. And because more of our being is involved, because we collected our being, recollected our being together, when we reflect with that more collected being, it has a much more profound effect on our whole being than when we reflect with a usual scattered being going off in all directions. It gets down deep, the effects get down deep, they affect how we feel and how we want to live, and not just our thinking, not just the top 2 inches of our head. So combined with studying the Dharma, meditating in this way on what we've studied, is a way to sort of let the Dharmic vision soak into our being, so it affects our eyes, it affects the way we see, it affects our heart, it affects the way we feel, it affects our bones. It's right sort of soaked into us. It affects the whole way we are in the world. So that's sort of reflective practices, if you like. And yet another really important type of practice is what's called in Pali Buddhanusati, recollection of the Buddha, mindfulness in the Buddha. And in many traditions this gets extended to mindfulness, to recollection of other Buddha figures, Bodhisattva figures that embody a particular aspect of enlightenment. So people will meditate on them, sometimes evoking them through mantra, visualizing them, feeling oneself to be in their presence, within their sphere of influence, on the plane that they exist, feeling ourselves as visitors to the plane on which they exist, so that their qualities begin to seep into us. So most order members are given that sort of practice, meditation on a Buddha and Bodhisattva, when they join the order. And in my experience, many of us find it very, very powerful. When we focus our attention on so that's a completely rogue phrase in my notes. When we focus our attention, full stop. Okay. Onwards.
Make at the end of that sentence.
So it's probably here somewhere. So according to Edward Conzer, the great translator of Mahayana texts, he says, and so I don't have to say this, but he says every mainstream school of Buddhism puts great emphasis on this sort of practice. And there's a traditional list, there would be, wouldn't there, of the effects of doing these sort of Buddhanussati practices, of recollecting the Buddha, calling the Buddha to mind, resting our attention on the Buddha. It's quite a long list, it's got all sorts of elements in it, but one of them, the one that I really want to focus on because of the content of this talk, is that it says their minds tend towards the plane of the Buddhas. If you focus your mind on the Buddha, your mind tends towards the plane of the Buddhas. As we've seen, beings exist on different planes, and the highest of those planes is the plane of the Buddhas, the plane on which enlightened beings exist. There's a saying, what you think about, or what we think about, that we become. What we think about, that we become. What we rest our attention on, that we become. When our mind dwells on an enlightened being, we become more like an enlightened being. Our level of consciousness is raised so that we tend towards the plane of the Buddhas. So those are a few sort of rather different seeming, perhaps, things that get lumped together under the heading of meditation. But, of course, though our mind might tend towards the plane of the Buddhas, there's probably a few planes between. So I'd like to move on towards the end of this talk. We're talking about some of these traditional planes of being, if you like, and the relationship between these and meditation. So I talked earlier about what happens when we recollect our being in the mindfulness of breathing. Resting the attention on the breath, bringing it back to the breath when it wanders so that the scattered parts of ourselves come together. So when we do that, what can happen is that the sort of normal chaotic verbal chatter begins to die down. As that happens, we might get a sense of physical ease, even of sort of grace in the body, even a sense of uplift in the body. We may get what's called a sign, nimitta, traditionally. For me, if this is happening to me, what often happens is I begin to see a cross in front of my eyes, and I ascribe no theological significance to this. It's more like a sign of integration. I see an upright and a cross. Other people I've talked to see colours, particular colour. Some hear particular sounds, music even. I know one person who hears music. And these are said to be signs, and they're signs that we have entered what's called access concentration. And it's called access concentration because now we stand at a doorway. We're at the point of access to a higher plane of being. And standing at this doorway can feel really scary. I mean, we can get into access concentration. You know, I've had people on the first and second night of an intermediate course say, well, this happened. And then I felt that was this huge drop in front of me, this huge, and it's like, well, in front of us is the unknown, and that can feel very, very scary. We can really want to draw back from it. We feel as though there's something where we could lose ourselves, and we could lose our normal self in it. We stand on the edge of the unknown. But if we stay in that state for a while, I mean, I have to say I've never experienced it as frightening. I'm just saying that other people have experienced it as frightening and told me how they drew back. I just experienced it as quite exhilarating. And if we stay in that state for a while, it can feel as though we just have stepped into a different world. We've been invited into a different world. We've stepped through a doorway into a different world. we've entered the first of what are called the dhyanas, the true states of meditation. Traditionally, there are 8 dhyanas, 4 initial ones that are described in quite a lot of detail, almost as though they were completely separate. You know, they're sort of like one, and then there's a fence, there's another, and there's a fence, there's another. They're described in quite a lot of detail. Now, this is a bit scary thing to say, but I actually think they merge into each other quite a lot, and the different people's experience of them is much more fluid than that. In the first, traditionally, the first is characterised by a lot of physical, or can be characterised by a lot of physical pleasure. Maybe it shivers up the spine, goose pimples, ooh, a bit like that wonderful piece of music that gives you goose pimples. Rushes of pleasure. They can almost feel sexual, actually. I know people who experience them as almost like sexual thrills. I have to say, this tends to be I haven't had this for a long time. This tends to be a bit of a temporary phenomenon. I think it goes away if you stay in that state. It's sort of releases of energy, I think. It's releases of energy. I think also if you meditate more and you're more used to some of these states, it doesn't happen so much either. I think it tends to be a phenomenon of maybe early experiences of it more. But yeah, there's always that physical pleasure and often a real sense of uplift, which can really persist. I've been on solitary retreat where I've luckily been in this state of it, and I go out for a walk afterwards, I feel light, I feel weightless. So that can sort of persist, this physical sense. In this state, there is still discursive thought. We can still think, but the thought takes on a new quality. I would describe that quality as inspired. I would say it was inspired. Solutions, my experience is I've had solutions arise to problems just quite spontaneously, just obvious what needs to be done. Or something that seemed like a big problem that was weighing me down, suddenly, what's the problem? It's not a problem at all. Understandings may arise, which you might call insights with a small I, quite spontaneously. So yeah, it's a very, very enjoyable state, and it's a state that you come back from feeling refreshed and perhaps even instructed. There's a traditional image for each of these. The image for this is a ball of soap powder, which is completely permeated with water. Apparently people used to wash with soap powder, so it's completely permeated with water. That's integration. Everything's absolutely brought together. And Sangharakshita calls it the stage of integration. And as I've said, I think these stages merge into each other. They aren't cut and dry. But traditionally, in the second dhyana, the physical pleasure dies away, and discursive subsides completely. The image that's used for this is a beautiful, beautiful, clear, calm pool or lake, pond, with a spring coming up in the middle. Of beautiful, clear, cool water coming up in the middle. So it's this image of being refreshed from somewhere else. Sangharakshita calls it the stage of inspiration. It's as though inspiration is flowing into our being from somewhere else. So he calls it the stage of inspiration. I talked about getting inspiration in the first dhyana. I mean, I don't see how you can have a inspiration without an element of discursive thought about it to make it inspiration. So I'm not sure they're completely separate, these two stages. Then in the third dhyana, this is compared to lotuses in the waters of a lake that are completely permeated by the water of the lake, completely surrounded and soaked by the medium. So what Sangharakshita says about this is that in our progress through the dhyanas, we become more and more integrated with the higher element of inspiration, which in the second dhyana is just trickling into our consciousness. By the time we reach the third dhyana, the stream has greatly expanded until it has become our whole environment. So we are that inspiration. This is a very rich experience of vertical integration. In the third dhyana, we feel as though we are part of something much greater than the conscious self, I think that's sometimes said that the barriers between us and the world also become much more sort of refined, permeable. But we feel as though we are part of something much greater than our conscious self. And Sangharakshita says it is a mystical state. It is a mystical state. So we've gone way beyond being a psychological exercise here. We're in a mystical state in which we feel that we are part of something much greater than ourselves. He says it is a mystical state in which we are completely surrounded, pervaded, and at one with a higher element, something higher than our usual self, maybe something higher than ourselves at all. And he calls this the stage of permeation. And then the fourth dhyana, said that the mind has become so powerful and the boundaries between ourselves and the world and others so permeable that our mind can actually have an effect on other people. We can actually affect the minds of others with our mind. And that might sound like complete tosh, but I had the experience quite some time ago now of spending quite a long time in a quite remote place, and there was one person who we just all acknowledged was one heck of a meditator. And there used to be a little bit of competition to sit beside him, actually, because if you sat beside this guy, you'd be sitting there going, 1, 2, 3, and then it'd be like, whoo! You'd feel that you were sort of washed by something. So let's not prejudge whether that might not be actually true. So that's the fourth dhyana. We can actually begin to affect other people. Our mind can have an effect on other people. There are 4 dhyanas beyond that. I'm not even going to say anything about them, partly because I've gone over time already. So traditionally, these four dhyanas that I spoke about, they're not just seen as states of mind. They're seen as lokas. They're seen as places, higher planes of being. They're called the rupa lokas. There are higher ones beyond that, the planes of refined or archetypal form. They're sort of heavenly realms, inhabited by divine beings even. Realms of great beauty, largely beyond our experience. They're largely beyond our experience, but they're described in a way we can understand, so we mustn't take this literally. Okay? This is a way of trying to describe something that's beyond our understanding to our limited understanding when we talk about their realms inhabited by higher beings. Don't be too literalistic. And yeah, there's stories in the Pali Canon, for example, there's the story of Nanda, who isn't really into the spiritual life because he's in love with this beautiful Shakyan girl and he just thinks about her all the time. So the Buddha, it is said, whisks him to a higher level of being where there are these beautiful dove-footed nymphs. I always used to think they got feet like doves, but I think they got not feet like doves' feet, they got feet like doves. Because they'd be pretty ugly if they had feet like doves' feet. Anyway, they're these beautiful, beautiful nymphs, and so he takes Nanda to this realm, and he takes him back again and says, and Nanda says, well, you know, they're really something. It's as though he's been shown true beauty. Going back to Pradaya's talk, he's been shown that there's a higher beauty. That is, and this is a metaphor. This is a metaphor for showing him meditative states, actually. It's a metaphor for him entering higher states in meditation. But not only that, there are these states we can enter in meditation. These realms can affect our whole being. We can't live in those realms all the time, but the influence of them can affect everything about our whole life. And we can learn from the experience. So we've got the story of a Sangha who meditated in a cave for 12 years, and during which he visited what's a heaven realm, where he was taught by the future Buddha Maitreya. And what he was taught by the future Buddha Maitreya became the basis of what's called the Yogacara tradition, which is the basis of masses of Far Eastern Buddhism. So there's that sense, again talking poetically and mythically, that we can visit these worlds and be taught by higher beings. So we are talking poetically and mythically, we can't take it literally, but in these realms, poetry and myth are truer than historic fact, actually. So, Meditation isn't just a psychological exercise, it's got a magic, a transcendental dimension. So how do we bring this into our practice? Quickly, rush for the line. Firstly, open up to the fact that it's not something that we do, okay? It's opening up to something beyond our present experience. We can't make it happen. We can't do it because we don't even know what we're trying to do. What we can do is create the experience, create the conditions for it to happen. So we put our effort into the mindfulness of breathing. We do the practice. But at the same time, we allow something else to happen. It seems there needs to be a balance between effort and receptivity. We're setting up the conditions with effort. We're allowing something to happen with receptivity. We're allowing something that almost seems to be done to us rather than us doing it. We're ushered through a door into a higher realm, or a higher voice speaks to us, speaking a higher wisdom. And secondly, make meditation not just a psychological exercise, but give it a mythical dimension. Make it an entry into a magical or mythic world. So the Buddha, it's traditionally the Buddha is said to have gained enlightenment on the Vajrasana, the diamond throne, that is the center of the universe. And in some traditions, for example, it says that when you sit down to meditate, you should view your meditation cushion as a branch establishment of the diamond throne that the Buddha sat on. Because some of the influence of that event 2,500 years ago is coming through every single meditation cushion that we sit upon. Whenever we sit in meditation, we enter the influence, we make ourselves open to the influence of the Buddha. The Buddha's influence reaches down even to us. So the Buddha's meditation was outside of time and space. It is not limited by time and space. It echoes still here, and we can connect with that. So you could imagine that. You could imagine that as you sit there, that you are opening up to this amazing influence coming down through all the years, through every meditator, every meditation seat. There's been a doorway blazed that we can follow. Finally, you could just imagine yourself when you're meditating sitting in the presence of a Buddha, a Bodhisattva, the Buddha or a Buddha or a Bodhisattva that appeals to you, feeling their wisdom, feeling their beauty, allowing their brightness to illuminate our mind. We may be doing the mindfulness of breathing, we may be doing the metta bhavana. We can do that in the presence of something higher. In the metta bhavana, feel their metta bathing us, or bathing all the people we bring to mind. So these are just a few examples of ways that we can make our meditation more mythic, more magical, which is what it's really meant to be. Thank you.